Good morning, everybody. Good morning. Congratulations on making it through Saturday night in New Orleans. I am proud of you for being here on a Sunday morning. In all seriousness, thank you and welcome to this panel. My name is Mark Bologna. I host a podcast called Beyond Bourbon Street. I did an interview with Bobby Fieseler and Clayton Dellery a couple years ago, right when Bobby's book came out about the upstairs lounge fire. And today I'm joined by a couple of documentarians and podcasters, and we're going to talk about our insights into the fire and the people, more importantly, and share some input for you. Just out of curiosity, how many of you have read a book about the upstairs lounge fire? Nearly everyone. How many have listened to a podcast about the upstairs lounge fire? Good. All right. So we're going to give you maybe some resources you've seen or maybe haven't seen. There's one coming. And we're just going to get into a discussion. I would invite your participation if you have questions of any of us as we get going. So without further ado, I would like to introduce our guest. First, next to me is Wright Anderson. It's a very small world. We actually grew up in the same neighborhood in Gentilly in New Orleans. Wright's documentary, The Upstairs Lounge Fire, was the first film ever produced about the tragedy, and it was actually my introduction to the Upstairs Lounge Fire, so I appreciate that. Among other things, Wright was instrumental, among several others, in identifying that Ferris LeBlanc and 3 other unknown victims of the tragedy were buried not where the city thought they were, but over in Rest Haven out in New Orleans East. And you may have heard a little bit about that yesterday. It certainly comes up in the documentaries. So thank you, Wright, for joining us. Next up, next to him is Joey, and I have Joey's information here. Well, you know what? I can do it off the top of my head. Joey was a child actor, right? Then went back to school and got involved in education, got involved in some activist things, and is producing a podcast that is in the process of being released right now that is really engaging. You can check out the trailer in the first episode now. It's called The Fire Upstairs. And again, this will be a theme, I think, in our discussion over the next hour. It's really about the tragedy, but much more so about the people. Both the people involved and the survivors and the legacy in the years since. So I'm excited to have Joey with us. And last but not least is Sheri Wright. She's a Pushcart Prize and Kentucky Poet Laureate nominee. She's the producer and director of the documentary Tracking Fire, which chronicles the Upstairs Lounge Fire. She's also done some work on the Pulse nightclub shooting, or massacre, I should say. And so with that, I'm going to ask each of you an opening question, and we're going to just try to have a discussion as much as we can and invite your participation. I think where I wanted to start, and we'll just go this direction and then we'll reverse, is Roy, or really each of you, how did you come to learn about the Upstairs Lounge Fire?
I came to learn about it through my dad, who's a big enthusiast of history, and he would take us around the French Quarter, me and my brothers, as we were kids, and he took us in front of what was then the upstairs, and he said something really terrible happened there. There was a really bad fire. It was a gay bar, and I was a little kid at that time, like maybe 12 or something like that, and I went to grad school, learned how to make documentaries. I said, this needs to be documented as well, because I've never seen it. As the anniversaries would go on, like when I was a kid, high school, all the way through college, you wouldn't see anything about the anniversary of the Upstairs Lounge. You would see the Wright Center fire anniversary, you'd see the Howard Johnson sniper anniversary, with nothing about the Upstairs Lounge. So I'm going to make a documentary about this so my generation, younger ones, can know something about it. And also, Johnny's in the crowd. He's instrumental in getting the literature. Like he did a lot of interviews, firsthand interviews in the 80s. And I remember before your book was published, you said, everyone's got to get a hold of Johnny's manuscript, the manuscript. So I want to thank him. I think Clay is in the crowd too. Clay also as well, very astute in his writing, his research as well on the Upstairs Lounge Fire. Very good book.
Joey, how about you? How did you first come to learn about the fire?
I actually learned about it on my first trip to New Orleans. It was about 8 years ago, and I had a friend who grew up here, and it never came up. I mean, we walked through the French Quarter the whole time. I sort of tell a bit of this on the first episode of the podcast. Apologies if you've heard it. But the upstairs didn't come up in conversation. I probably passed the building several times. It was the day I was leaving, and Johnny's book had been somehow acquired by my friend's family. They had a history or knowledge of it, so they wanted to get a copy of it. It was the first book at the time, so of course they had it. And I was just stopped in my tracks, stunned by what I saw, the cover art, the title, and my friend could clearly see that it was affecting me, and he was like, "Why don't you take it?" So I took it. I was flying back to New York, and I read it on the flight, and I was just like sobbing and like just completely overwhelmed by it. And then once that passed, it occurred to me that no one that I knew had ever known about this either. Right. And then over the course of months and years, then every time I would bring it up, it was kind of the same case. It was no one had heard about it. And how is that? Why is that? So yeah, I mean, we'll get into, what that turned into for me, but that was my first introduction to it. And I think we all have Johnny to thank for that.
Yeah. And Sheri, how about you? How did you first come to know of the fire?
Watching some stupid Ghost Hunters episode. And it was the most, it was just, they got so much information wrong, come to find out. They didn't even give it the correct name. They called the upstairs lounge the Gemini. No slide on the Gemini. So that was the first time I'd heard about it, and I was shocked. I was really pissed off to find out about it this way, and why didn't I know about this? Why didn't anybody that I know about this? And so at that time in 2012, there just wasn't that much information on the internet. I began to Google, and what I did find, coincidentally, was mostly on the Gemini had a page dedicated to the upstairs lounge. And I saw the photographs, and the photograph of Jim Larson it just haunted me. It stuck. The whole story stuck, and then here I am. And like Joey said, I'll get into how that came to be, but that was my introduction. And again, I want to reiterate, thank you, Johnny. You blazed the trail. You made all of this possible, and Clayton as well. There's so many voices on this.
Bobby, too. Bobby B.
See you in the back? Oh, you snuck in here. I didn't see you. For me, I grew up in New Orleans, as I mentioned, a native. I grew up with an uncle who was gay. He married my aunt, and then, as was typical, the early 70s, late 60s, they got married fairly quickly. He came out. They got divorced. I grew up in a very Roman Catholic family, but very unlike Roman Catholic families, we always kept Joe in the family. And I never knew as a young boy any different. I just had a gay uncle that lived in the French Quarter in Governor Nichols, and he was involved in our lives, and that was the way it was. But he would have frequented the upstairs lounge. And in fact, yesterday while I was prepping, I found a photo that I'm pretty sure is him the day of the fire. And so for me, it has always been personal and something. And again, like you said, Joey, how many people don't know? Even in my own family, had no idea about the upstairs lounge fire. And when I talk to people through the podcast and here in New Orleans, I would venture it's upwards of 80% of New Orleanians, and I mean lifelong New Orleanians, people that were alive back then, have no idea. They can talk about the Howard Johnson's massacre, they can talk about the Rold fire, both of which were very, very close in proximity, but they have no, and in time, really, and have no idea. And so for me, it was very personal. I learned a little bit through my family, but again, Johnny's book, Clayton's work, and Roy's work really were what opened my eyes to it. And then we'll get into a little bit more, what do you do with that? So with that, I'd like to talk a little bit about each of your projects and maybe have you introduce it and talk about your inspiration for it and really what your project is. So I'll start with you. Again, actually, I'll start with you, Sheri, so that we alternate back and forth. So if you can talk a little bit about your project and where we're at with it, and also how people can help you continue that work that you're doing.
Sure. And I want to make a correction. I misspoke. I meant to say Reverend Bill Larson. So, it's Sunday morning. So in New Orleans. So forgive me for that. I've interviewed for this documentary about 50 people here in New Orleans, and some people, there's always going to be people that nobody knows about. And, I've interviewed some of those people and some very familiar faces as well. And two of them happen to be sitting right here. Ferris LeBlanc's family members. In fact, quite a few people here I've interviewed. And And so we had completed filming, and we were just beginning to get into the preliminary editing, and then Pulse happened. And so, I had to take a step back for a minute and just kind of absorb all that. And as I was watching the news footage, I started seeing similarities between both of these tragedies and a lot of dissimilarities. And I thought, I need to go film some of this and include it in the film, because this is important. Where have we come from 1973? And where do we continue to need to push forward to? And also to show, well, I could just go on and on about it, but there's so many similarities. The glaring similarity is that both of the people who committed these atrocities were sexually conflicted men. And I thought that this is important. This is a cautionary tale. Not just about our sexuality, but about our society in general, and about any conflict that we may have for ourselves. But so that's kind of where the film is now. We completed filming for the Pulse nightclub shooting, and now we're in the process of getting one of the most challenging things related to any project, and that's getting the finishing funds. So that's where things stand now.
Sure, and I'd like to point out, Sheri's film is called Tracking Fire. If you Google her name, Sheri Wright, and Tracking Fire, it will come up. There's a trailer there, and there's also an opportunity if you'd like to contribute to the project. So I did that yesterday, in fact, as I was preparing. So not only did I watch the trailer, but contributed. I would encourage you to do the same. It's important work, and it continues the body of work that's so important to keeping the memory, again, particularly not so much of the tragedy, but of the people that who lost their lives, and those family members and friends that had to continue on with their lives. So thank you. Joey, let's talk a little bit about how you came to decide to do a podcast and what the podcast is going to be like. You've released one episode and a trailer that I would encourage people to listen to, but if you could share your story a little bit.
Yeah, well, it's called The Fire Upstairs, and that was a great setup, actually, because like so many people interested in these events in our shared history, Pulse was really a catalyzing event, but also just a reminder. So there was a resurgence and a regeneration of interest in the upstairs lounge fire after Pulse happened. So that was the case for me. And I have to say, I think honestly, probably after Pulse was when I really became more active in my community, as far as volunteering, reaching out, educating myself, picking up Clayton's book, and then it would have been a couple of years until Bobby's book came out, but really trying to do more digging into our collective history. And for me, it was like finding a new branch of a family tree would feel for someone. It was like, okay, so how is this connected to this, and where does this connect to that? The podcast came about because we were coming up on the 50th, and it felt like we wanted to reach the most people in starting with our age group, our generation, right? So I met my producer in grad school. He had never heard of it either, and he's my age. So it was like, well, we have to share this with as many people as we can as quickly as possible, because the 50th is coming up, and like, what's the quickest media format? And it was like, let's do a podcast. So, and then of course the thought is like, well, how do we contribute to the conversation? What do we say that hasn't already been said? Where do we fit into this? And it became pretty clear almost right away that there was just a huge chasm in our collective history that we lost generationally because of the AIDS crisis, because of men of a certain generation passing and not being able to give us our history, the verbal storytelling tradition that we have. So we tried to sort of like take up that mantle with it and set up the show in a way that, as our first episode does, kind of contextualizes the history, tracks the events in a way that is understandable and compassionate, but doesn't really deep dive in the way that some other projects have, as far as the crime element of it, I would say. And then from there, we build it out, and we really do focus on having conversations. Some of the guests are historians and archivists and journalists, but it's also people who are doing the work in the political realm today that maybe didn't know about the Upstairs Lounge, but are able to inform listeners really how similar the circumstances were that were contributing to what happened in 1973, just as well as they are now with, drag bans and protecting children and don't say gay. And it's all kind of this same pernicious snake that's just raveled through our history. Excuse me. So, yeah.
So when you said that, thank you. It reminded me, we were supposed to have another panelist today. We were supposed to have Joey Madden, who is an ABC producer and television personality. He produced a mini documentary that was the first, I think, ever to air on national television. And he wasn't able to be with us today, but one of the things that what you just said spurred for me is in his documentary, he talks to Clay Higgins, who is I would say, somewhat controversial, to put it mildly, political figure here in Louisiana, and someone who I would not think of or expect to be a partner with the LGBTQ community. I don't think I'm often saying that, and yet the connection for him was that Clay Higgins cares very much about military veterans, and so in the case of Ferris LeBlanc, became very passionate. And you talk about like an unlikely partnership. I can't think much. I also think sometimes he says one thing publicly and maybe does something a little bit differently. But I thought it was interesting that Joey, and that's something I would have asked Joey about, his decision to interview Clay Higgins, because he's a pretty controversial figure. But I also think we take whatever chances we can with whoever we can to try to make things right.
You want to have as broad of a conversation as I think you can. You want to come at something with such importance, with as much information and knowledge as you can. And then you can disagree with it, but I think open dialogue and discussing something as thoroughly as possible is always the best approach, especially when you're covering something with such enormous historical importance.
Yeah. It was just shocking to me, because I know in my other part of my life, I know Mr. Higgins a little bit, and it was unlikely. But again, I think you have to take chances, right? And some of those don't pan out, obviously. And certainly in the case of Ferris LeBlanc, roadblock after roadblock with government entities, right? And I know you all have lived that. So, Roy, can you talk a little bit about how your project came to be and what it's about, and kind of your angle and your focus in your documentary?
Thanks. It came out in 2013. It took about, 4 years to complete. I released a couple of more documentaries before then, the Luling Ferry disaster and the Continental Grain Elevator explosion. So the Luling Ferry disaster one caused a lot of stir in the Destrehan community. A lot of the victims were not honored properly, and because of that film, to make a documentary with a thumbs up, it's got to be controversial. Like, I called out a few politicians, and anyway, it led to the creation of a monument for the victims out there in Destrehan. So I took I said, look, the same thing's going on with the upstairs lounge fire. There's nothing, the plaque was out there, but you never see it, like, anniversary after anniversary on TV. I said, I'm going to make this documentary, and they put it on TV on Cox Cable in three areas: Baton Rouge, New Orleans, and Lafayette. But there's interviews with eyewitnesses, people who were affected by it, family members of the victims, firemen. And I'm also a history teacher, and that's another reason why I did it, because you don't see these tragedies in the curriculum for history. The upstairs lounge is not in there. Pan Am Flight 759. This was the worst mass murder of gays in U.S. history prior to the Pulse nightclub shooting. Pan Am Flight 759 was the worst vehicular crash in the city's history. Why is that not being taught? The Luling Ferry disaster was the worst ferry boat accident in U.S. history. So I felt that there was a chasm there, that work needed to be produced. So that's what I did. And some surprise. Are there any young filmmakers or anyone who wants to be a filmmaker out here? Or no? Don't. Yeah.
How about an old film?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, if you have a good idea, just stick to it. You'll have some naysayers come up to you and say, "What are you doing? Do something else." But just if you have a focus and you're passionate about it, do it. I mean, I do it very traditionally, old school. It's like my old composition notebook. Gaines High School, and I just do the microfilm, look at the microfilm, spend a lot of time in the library, write numbers down from the newspaper, and then get an old phone book, and make some calls, because they're mostly the people back from that generation. They have home lines, so that's how I do it. And you find other stuff, and I'm glad it was very successful. And later when they had the COVID crisis and all that, the history press wanted me to do a collection. Why don't you do something write a book about this? And so I did that, and there it is, New Orleans disasters. So I'm glad the history is not being lost, and I thank you too for also, and all y'all for keeping this story alive.
So one correction, I think I called Mr. Madden Joe Madden, and it's Pete Madden. So I apologize for that. In my case, so I have a podcast that's general interest New Orleans. We do a combination of things to do as well as historical topics. I am not a member of the LGBTQ community, though, again, as I mentioned, I grew up with a gay uncle and just accepted that as just part of life, which I think is fabulous to not know any different. But because I have an audience that is specifically not in that group, I felt a real obligation and an opportunity to share a story that so many people, both within and outside of the community, don't know anything about. And so I knew a little bit from my early days. I knew that my uncle probably was a patron of the Upstairs Lounge. And when I started the podcast, this was the one topic that I was very nervous about. I felt like I had to earn my chops, and in terms of being an interviewer, as well as the respect of the community. And I really didn't know where to turn. I was familiar with John's work, I was familiar with Clayton's work, and then through my day job, actually, someone said, there's this book coming out called Tinderbox. Now, how he knew about it, I have no idea. But that led me to Bobby, who has become a dear friend in the years since. By that point, I had been podcasting for a couple of years, and I felt like I had a big enough audience that it would make an impact, that if I shared it, I could get it out to a larger audience. Because as much as I believe it's important to celebrate and to mourn the lives of those that were lost, as well as to honor those of you that survived and family members, I also think it's important to get it out to a broader perspective. And so one thing I'm incredibly proud of is that I have the opportunity, because I have sort of a general interest New Orleans podcast, to put that out. And as you've seen probably in researching and putting out your podcast, even today, if you search for Upstairs Lounge Fire podcast, there's only a couple of episodes across the millions of episodes of podcasts that have been done. There's only a handful, I think about 5 total. Including your first one, mine, or 2 of, I think, 5, period, that you'll find. So when you think about that, and you think about the millions and probably close to billions of podcast episodes, there's very little about this history. And so I felt like I have a platform, and with that came a responsibility to share. So that's what caused me to do it. Now I would ask each of you, and I'll start with you, Roy, this time, what did you learn along the way, maybe that was most surprising or most impactful to you as you researched this project?
I learned a lot. I mean, I was aware that the media was not covering it as they should have, but there's some other things that you learn as well. And there's Skip and Lori are up in the front row. In my documentary, there's a clip of the victims of the fire that were unnamed, that were buried in a field, a potter's field. And I thought, too, I said, well, I think it's Delgado, the potter's field out there in the Holt Cemetery. And then a year later, 2014, you called up and said, we need to find out where Ferris is. So I went back to the UNO library, sat there, doing the microfilm thing again. And then I flipping through it, and then I realized it was Rest Haven out there in New Orleans East. So that was what surprised me, and that's like, oh, that's great that we finally know where they're at, and I learned something, and hopefully the city of New Orleans can do something to place at least a plaque or something there. They're trying. I'm thinking about the Mother's Day bus crash. That was the worst vehicular accident in the city's history, and it happened in City Park, and there's still nothing out there, and they're kind of kicking the can down the road, City Park, the CEOs, but at least the city of New Orleans is trying, and hopefully we can get at least some kind of marker there for the victims and for Ferris. He was a World War II veteran.
Joey, how about you?
Learned so much, still learning as I'm actively pursuing the project. But two things that come to mind were what I've learned about trauma, dealing with it and processing it for not just folks who experienced the upstairs lounge fire in real time, but in talking about it today, it still triggers such an emotional reaction. Or truly, on the other end of the spectrum, it's still hard to talk about. So I'm still actively learning about processing trauma, which leads me to the second thing that I'm thinking about, which is time. Which is time's sort of this flat circle, and it doesn't really, it doesn't work in a linear way. Like there are people who I'm sure lived through this 50 years ago who are still processing what happened. And that 50 years doesn't mean that it should have been dealt with already by now. And in the same way that time sort of is reflecting itself, it's sort of like looping back again in a lot of the cultural circumstances that we've been experiencing that lent themselves to what happened in '73. So that for me has been really illuminating because it affects my approach to the work. And as you were talking about creating a podcast that lives in this sort of vacuum of millions and billions of digital space, what we create and produce will remain. You know, you create a documentary, and that becomes a resource for someone who stumbles onto this history and finds that years to come. So it's been informing the way that I approach the work in a way that I'm really grateful for. I don't think you have to overemphasize how traumatic this experience was. So that also has been something that I've actually found comfort in, because sometimes you get on the mic and you talk about events like this, and it's like, wow, I didn't realize there's tape of me like crying, and I didn't expect that would be an emotional reaction as I'm like, I've written this copy and I'm going to just deliver it to the microphone, and then suddenly you're overwhelmed by emotion. So it's been a personal education as well as a cultural education, I would say.
Yeah, I think your point about the 50 years is really insightful in that in many ways it doesn't matter, right? You think time lessens things, but it really doesn't. And maybe Sheri, you'll get to this in a minute, as other things happen and we see how reactions are, it makes you realize in some ways how far we've come and how far we have to travel, particularly with the way that the people around us respond to tragedies like this, right? And Sheri, how about you? What are some of the things that maybe you've learned or that surprised you through your work, not only on the upstairs lounge fire, but then as you're doing that, the Pulse nightclub shooting?
Well, that is a whole big can of worms there. There were so many things that I found surprising. One relates to Ferris LeBlanc and the fact that the FBI totally dropped the ball on contacting their family when they had the information to do so right there in front of them, and they chose not to. Why is that surprising, though? But I guess I was shocked at first. The other thing was the amount of synchronicities that occurred in the production of this film. Not to sound too airy-fairy, crystal waving. Okay. you have crystals? All right. Okay.
I think you're in a safe space here.
I think so. All right, let's break out the patchouli then. I'm not going to say what I was going to say, but anyway, y'all can probably guess. Like, for instance, we got picked up by a taxi cab, and the guy was really gregarious, nice, friendly. We chatted, what are y'all doing here? And we told him, and he said, well, it just so happens that my cousin was a first responder. I haven't seen him in a long time, but let me give him a shout. So we did, and we got an interview with him. And it was the last interview that he provided. I think, Roy, you interviewed this fireman in your film. Yeah. But in doing that, Ron Pennison was the cab driver's name. Super nice dude, who's unfortunately not with us anymore. But this also provided him an opportunity to have a reconciliation with his cousin, because they'd been estranged for some time. So there was just, a continuous number of things that occurred like that. We had a couple of disasters in the production, but it turned out to be a blessing in disguise, because the next thing that happened was it turned out better. One of the surprises was, and I'm going to relate to what you were saying, was when you're holding space for somebody that is telling you about the worst day of their life, that that they're going to carry with them into this life and wherever it is that we go. It is hard as hell to keep your shit together. But you have to show empathy, but at the same time you have to be able to do your job and be professional. And that was the hardest part of the job of doing any of this, was keeping that balance. The other surprising thing was the amount of family, new family, I'm going to call this, that I got. And for that, I'm really grateful.
Yeah, that's great. I think for me, two things jumped out. One was by day, I work in a large bureaucratic organization that helps veterans. I'll say that. And I had no idea how many of these men and women were veterans. And so Bobby and I actually got to work on a project to help honor one of the veterans that died in the fire, who was buried in someone else's tomb in St. Roch Cemetery. We were able to get his military honors placed and the insignia of his branch of service placed there. So I had no idea. I've spent 30 years in this organization and had no idea. I knew about the fire, but I didn't know about how many were veterans. And it makes sense if you think about the time frame, right, and the age of these men and women. The second thing and the thing that was probably most profound to me, that I never stopped to think about until I really got into it, is that for the survivors, the next day having to go to work and not being able to outwardly process the trauma in any way, right? In a couple of the documentaries, in Mr. Madden's documentary, I think in yours, people talk about being in the military and having to go back to base and not being able to grieve, or having to go back to work and being petrified that the newspapers published the names of not only the deceased, but first they published the names of the survivors that they could identify. And then later at the memorial, the press got a hold of that and tried to out people in a time. I always thought of New Orleans, again, because of my own kind of sheltered background and growing up with an uncle who was outwardly gay and didn't know any better. I just assumed this was such a safe haven for the LGBTQ community, and in many ways it was a safe haven, but in no way was it safe as you would think of, say, for me as a heterosexual male. Completely different level of safe. And I was just really almost traumatized by thinking about these people that have had, like, as you said, Sheri, the worst day of their life, and then tomorrow they have to bottle that up and go do their jobs and live their lives mostly in the closet for fear of losing their jobs or being labeled as outcasts or whatever. And I cannot imagine what that must be like. And that was really moving and traumatic for me, as I tried to, as you expressed, Sheri, tried to process this. And I was thinking about those things the day I was interviewing Robert and Clayton, and trying not to be emotional and do your job. And at the same time, it's an emotional thing, And the fact that then when the Pulse nightclub happened, you sort of saw a repeat of that, Certainly, maybe we are in an era where people didn't have to worry as much, but they still had to worry. And still there was this expectation that the world just moved right back on. Unlike with other tragedies that we see that happen, where we take, 9/11, for instance, where we all grieve publicly and there's lots of recognition. That's not the case with these events. And that's a pretty traumatic thing. And that was something that was really, really moving to me and shocking. Yeah, of course you can.
Because there was back in the books in '73, there was a crime against nature statute that made sexual acts between gay men illegal. So you had people that they didn't want to go in front of the camera. that was one of and also the medical professionals, the diagnostic statistical manual of mental disorders. They had homosexuality was in there. I think they knocked it out of books, I don't know, maybe like a few months later after the upstairs lounge fire. So it was a lot different back then.
I think the statute is still on the books and has not been actually removed.
Is it? Or I thought it was removed in the
I don't think it was removed. I think they basically they still have it because it affected a lot of transgender African American females.
Yeah, it's changed a little in the DSM, but there are still some things that affect it. Yeah.
And if you see the documentary Can,
Yep.
it talks a lot about that.
Yeah. I want to get to the opportunity to ask questions, but I have one more question for you guys and then anything that you'd like to add. And from your perspective as documentarians, what do you think we still need to do, both with the upstairs lounge fire and in general with the community at large? What would you think you still want to see done in telling this story and in telling other stories like it? Sheri, I'll start with you.
Stay engaged. Don't ever stop talking. Always be a voice. Even when you think nobody's listening, there might be somebody in the background that needs to hear what you have to say, and support each other in those voices. We all have a responsibility as human beings, but also to our community. We want equality. We want to live a balanced life, and we can't do that unless we work together. So roll your sleeves back and get out there and do whatever is within your skill set, and maybe push yourself beyond what you thought you could do.
Great point. Great point.
It's funny, I almost had a moment where I was like, wow, I feel the same, but then I was like, well, that makes sense. We're here as storytellers.
Right. You're among your people.
Yeah, exactly. And to add to that, I feel like when I talk to young people, especially about this, there's a bit of anger, there's a bit of rage, and whether that's anger in the sense of being upset or mad about it, but anger in the sense of passion and not letting it be forgotten. And I would tell people my age, younger, obviously it probably doesn't pertain to anybody here, but give yourself grace and a little bit of forgiveness if you're just coming onto the Upstairs Lounge history now. Allow yourself to find the story whenever you do and let it matter to you however it does. I think that's how we continue our legacy. I think that's how it fits into a larger narrative. And there's so much already as queer people, as people who are sort of on the margins of communities, that we have to deal with unpacking a lot of internalized guilt and shame and whatever our background and our stories are. When we arrive to the moment where we realize who we are, where we fit into a larger narrative, I think that's beautiful, and I think you should run in that direction. So that's what I hope I'm offering to people coming to finding my podcast. I hope that it gives them that sort of space to explore and to learn and understand and feel like, okay, this actually is my story too.
I think that's a beautiful sentiment about coming to it as you are and trying not to say, well, gosh, it was 50 years ago, why did I not? Or all the, right? But here you are today. I also think it's something about what all of us are doing and what those of you that have written books have done is we're putting things into the world, and that's scary as hell, frankly. But it also means that people will find it in 6 months, in 6 years, in 50 years. And there's something really powerful about that we get to help continue the story. So the further we get from it and the further we get from direct people that were there or survivors or family, we're kind of bookmarking, right, and cataloging. Somebody will read Tinderbox in 20 years and it will be their first approach to this story and will trigger lots of things, hopefully some activism, but also to keep the memory alive, right?
Well, I hope that our civic leaders or politicians can do something to honor all of the victims. I was there yesterday for the memorial service, and it was a tearjerker, of course, but there was one banner with unknown survivors, unknown victims, and we know, along with Ferris LeBlanc, that they're out there somewhere, but they made a public recognition and apologized and all that, but it just seems to look like there's nothing happening. There's no activity. They need to get more. I think there should be a plaque out there somewhere at Rest Haven for these victims. And that's what I hope, that they can step up to the plate and do something in honor of Ferris and those other unknown victims who were buried out there in that field. That's what I hope. More action from our politicians.
And the thing that I hope is, and it's something you alluded to earlier, Roy, I want to see this and other stories of persecution be taught in our schools. I'm the father of 11-year-old twin daughters, and so they go to private school and have a little bit more influence in private school, frankly. I've been able to bring this story to the headmaster of the school and to say, I don't know, you get to be the judge of where the right age is appropriate to delve into this and other things, like the 1868 massacre in St. Bernard Parish, for instance, is another one that's not taught in school books. But I would like to do this, and I'm happy to bring in a Bobby Fiesler or Clayton Dellery or whomever. I'm happy to do an interview panel, but I want this taught in schools. And I can only start where I am, right? So I can't change maybe public schools, but I can make a change in one school. And I think that kind of gets to something you said too about, like, find it where you are, do what you can. With that, we have about 15 minutes. Are there any questions? I'm going to walk out and give you the microphone so that everyone can hear you and that it can be recorded.
Hi, I'm Lori Bailey. My husband Skip is Ferris's nephew. We've been fighting since 2015 to get his body back. A plaque's not enough. We want the body. And we want the 3 unidentifieds out of there. So instead of asking a question, I'm going to answer one, and that was, why did Pete Madden get Higgins involved in this? Well, obviously, this is a political issue, and he wanted to give Higgins the opportunity to do what was right to help us. So I'm going to tell you what he did. He sent us a 9-page document from the State Attorney General's office of all the hoops that we had to jump through, which were absolutely impossible to have any chance to get Ferris's body back. That's what Higgins did for us. We are so thankful for J.P. Morrell and his office and what they're trying to do. Where we are stuck now, it is at the state legislature's level. And they are the only ones who have the equipment, the ground penetrating radar, and the ability to get us in that field to look and to dig to get these 4 men out of there. However, there is a stipulation that equipment can only be used in the event of a natural disaster. So we are working, J.P. Morrell is working with the state legislature. We are working on trying to get around the block with this to try to get those men out of that damn field. It's been 50 years. And as I'm sitting here listening to these stories, I'm going to tell you, I believe that we are going to start documenting what's called Finding Ferris and exposing all the bullshit that we have been through. Because my mother-in-law, his sister, thank you. My mother-in-law is 93 years old. She is the last living LeBlanc of the 13 siblings. We promised her in 2015 that we would bring Ferris home. She is still alive, and we have still not brought Ferris home. And I'm going to tell you, we are not going to stop until we do. Thank you.
First of all, Joy, I want to say it's great that you're doing this. We've talked a lot in previous sessions about, it was, for the younger generation, it was 50 years ago. Why does it matter? And I think your work is very instrumental in that. And a question I have for all of you is, why do you think that, this story is people are starting to learn about this? And I know I've lived in some other cities and been members of gay groups and things, and I've tried to educate people in those cities about it. And the easiest way for me has pretty much been Robert Camina's Upstairs Inferno, because it's streaming on Tubi and free services and things. But I also mentioned there are other documentaries, and there are 3 books on the subject and things to people. And I actually was instrumental in getting a production of The View Upstairs done at one of the community theaters in Raleigh, North Carolina. I suggested it to the director, and he did it this spring, and I went up there to see it. But I want to know why you think it didn't get all the publicity like Stonewall and the Pulse nightclub's shooting and all that. Why did this thing not? I mean, I know that the environment here was not conducive to that, but I would have thought that maybe the national media would have picked it up. And so I'm just kind of curious as to your views on that.
Because it was an atrocity, not a revolution. It's such heavy subject matter that it's difficult to present this to people in a digestible way that they want to hear. Everybody wants to put their fist up, right? But nobody wants, I shouldn't say nobody, it's harder to get people engaged in the immensity of 32 people dying in such a horrific way, and then getting buried a second time by the city. What are they going to do? What can you do? You can't go marching in the street to the city, and this happened such a long time ago as well. But we have to find ways to keep people engaged with that, because those ripple effects still continue today, and we're seeing a rising wave of hate crimes against not just the LGBTQ community, but against any marginalized community.
Oh, yeah, that's right.
It was also, it remains unsolved to this day, but the number 1 suspect was a gay man. Okay, so it was a gay-on-gay crime. So the media back then, why didn't they report it as much as they should have? It's not like a hate crime like you and me think about it today. So did that play into it? I don't know, but that just needs to be said as well.
Yeah, one of the ways that I've been putting it is that something like Stonewall, where it fits in our history, it was loud. Upstairs Lounge was a very quiet event in our history. At the time, by virtue of the closet, by virtue of sort of sweeping all of this under the rug, by the city efforts, by all the circumstances surrounding it at the time, it was a very quiet event, but no less pivotal. So I think it's just still sort of coming across people because it's been such a quiet event, and that just by its nature, it's going to take a lot longer to catch on, but it is.
I also think what I would add to that is in New Orleans at that time, there were several big events within a couple of years span. The Rolled Fire, the Howard Johnson sniper incident, if you're not familiar with those. And I think those were general population things, for lack of a better way to explain it, right? And those captured the attention and the fear in the city and made it very convenient to focus on those things that felt like they were everybody, as opposed to a marginalized population. So I think that's part of it. Yes?
David Campbell. I wanted to ask the panel a question. Yesterday, I asked a question of the audience whether there was anyone alive who saw the physical horror, and somewhat to my surprise, apparently not. And I didn't know I was going to be attending this to be the surviving witness to what I saw. So given that, I would be curious to know in your research, Roy, and if, because I wrote about it in my book, I mentioned the fire, but I was leading a double life, and I was hiding, and I've been hiding in the woods since then. I was practicing law downtown, but I had a place for my lover and me to go in the woods where I still live, near Folsom. In any of your research, did you come across any people who did stand there and see what I saw?
Yeah, Stuart did.
Yeah.
I think you have a panel later today with Clancy Dubois. And oh, you're on the panel. Clancy was on the scene and was a young man at the time. I don't know if any of you.
Ricky?
Yeah.
Clancy was a guest on our first episode. I've spoken to him in my research as well, which is super helpful.
I interviewed 2 other people who were witness to the fire, one of whom was stuck in traffic, an attorney with his children in the car. So he described, I don't want to give too much away, but he described an explosion. He also witnessed 2 gentlemen leaving the upstairs lounge, described them, and you know, it's who's to say who was who in that. But he described all of a sudden, not long after that, there was an explosion from the upstairs window, glass shattered all over his car, got inside on his children, and they tried to get away, you know, and they finally did exit that area, but he came back. And he saw what other people saw.
Hi, my name's Lisa Farrar, and I just want to say I was invited to be at this whole conference by Frank Perez to do comfort care because I'm a registered nurse, but I also sit on the board for NAMI, National Alliance on Mental Illness. And y'all have, I want to plead my ignorance to how involved this fire was. I moved here from Atlanta in 1977, fresh out of high school. And I had a gay teacher in high school, and I didn't realize at the time how hidden everything was. I always thought everything was more open in New Orleans and everything. And it devastates me now to hear how this was not presented over all the years I've been here. I was a charity ER nurse and did trauma care for 10 years and worked through Charity Hospital and saw how the doctors and nurses, you know, when you're showing empathy, did not go out to the gay community. And it was devastating to me because I was brought up with empathy. So I just want to tell y'all, thank y'all so much for allowing me to be here because y'all have comforted me more than I've had to comfort any of y'all here. So, and I was in tears last night watching that film. And I look forward to the rest of the documentaries later today. I know Roy, because we had been in a community class for the FBI previously, and I am very curious to find out from Ferris's family why. You know, did y'all not know he was part of that community? What took so long, and what finally sparked that y'all realized that that's where he was? And I'm devastated for you that I can't understand why they won't give you and let him rest in peace with y'all. So anyway, I just want to say thank y'all so much. Thank you, because you have my full support, and I know NAMI support y'all too. If anybody needs anything, please reach out.
Really important. Thank you. I'm going to go there, then I'll come there.
Thank you and your organization for volunteering. You've been here every day, and we really appreciate it.
Very important to me.
Hey guys, my question is for Joey. So Joey, your podcast, The Fire Upstairs, really I think casts the widest possible net when considering how do we tackle this tragedy. And you've interviewed so many people that I think none of us have thought to interview before about the Upstairs Lounge, like Ben de la Creme or political strategists or the HRC. My question is, what was it like for you, considering the wideness of the angle you took on this, to speak to individuals and ask them about the Upstairs Lounge who'd never publicly talked about the Upstairs Lounge before?
Thanks for the question. Surprisingly not difficult, because as it turns out, the Upstairs Lounge has so much in common with a lot of our queer experience. The places that we find ourselves, the way that we discover our senses of identity. For instance, Ben de la Creme, they had never heard about it before, but I was able to sort of find common ground where I told Ben de la Creme about the charity events and drag shows that happen there, and that's something that Dela could relate to. And so it immediately mattered. And then so that conversation talks about, well, where did you feel it was your second home coming up as a young queer person? Where was the first place you felt your sense of identity was really supported and seen? So that's actually a direct effort of this podcast, is to reach out to people, not only who were directly involved and who knew the history and could retell it as best as possible, but to folks who really didn't have any previous knowledge, because we wanted to have those conversations. And by having those conversations and sort of transmitting them to the larger world, we're allowing other people to have similar conversations. And so that's the hope, and I appreciate the point in the question.
I just want to make a comment about public education that you made at the point. I was a school teacher for 8 years. I've been in library work for 44 years. The last 20 has been at the Louisiana Special Collections at UNO. I know Roy. We provided the film footage for the Upstairs Inferno film. Libraries are pretty much almost one of the last bastions of intellectual freedom, even where people meet. We don't have the malls, and folks get afraid to get shot, and we're worried now about that happening in libraries. Public schools, Jefferson, Madison, John Adams, we all were taught, most of us, that education was essential for democracy. Look where there's the ignorance, no education, high correlation between that and democracy. For how many decades now have I seen the public assault by a particular party on education? It brings us where we are today, and I would say in some cases we have the inmates running the asylum. Don't give up on public schools. Frankly, speaking with educators here and elsewhere, and I haven't taught myself, the charter schools, in some ways it's just another privatization effort to take away the authority of parents. Parochial schools, fine, but don't give up on that factor that public education. A letter in the Times-Picayune, some gentleman brought up the fact that we have all these concerned parents. Do you know when public education was set up for the common good of all of us, not just one segment, one religion, one bigot? And we need to reclaim that right that is essential, we the people, all the people, and that we don't give up on public education. If you want to send your kid to some bigoted school, fine, but don't give up on public education. I'm glad you have an enlightened school, but it's very essential that we realize the importance of telling our story and keeping our story in the schools. Thank you.
I think, let me check, I think we are about out of time. Yes, we have 1 minute left. So you get the last question, sir.
Thanks, and that's really perfect because I wanted to build on the question on that. My question for y'all is, right now through the state legislature, we have some bills.
I'm so sorry, but you.
Oh, I'm sorry. Thank you. Good point. Sorry about that. But state legislature, there's some bills that still are trying to harm our community, and one of the things y'all are pushing, because y'all are raising awareness of this event, is there plans to make sure and fight that your videos, your DVDs, your films, your podcasts, and for the authors in the room for the books y'all have written over the years, to make sure that they remain in our libraries? And also the moderator, there you go. You talked about having it taught in school. Right now, the governor's about to veto a bill, don't say gay. You wouldn't be able to, because it deals with sexual orientation, is part of the story. So for everybody in the room, if you see that, for instance, the governor vetoes that bill, then if there's an override session, please contact your legislator and tell them, perfect example of this, we want this to continue to be in our libraries, and we want it to be taught. Thank you. But are there plans for that to happen?
Thank you. And I think, Joe, you talked about that a little bit, about, take whatever action you can from wherever you happen to be. And one of those is contacting your elected representatives.
Yeah, pardon the visual, but as you're asking the question, I was thinking about whack-a-mole. And the important thing is that they're always going to be trying to hit us, but we just keep popping up, and that's all that matters. Keep writing books, keep making documentaries, keep making podcasts, keep telling stories, and refuse to be silenced, basically. And as far as legislation goes, unfortunately and sadly, it's been the case, and I think it will remain to be the case, that we're always fighting measures like that. But my advice is to just think of it like whack-a-mole and keep popping up.
I would add to that it's important to get it, I don't know a gentle way to say it. It's important to me to be involved as someone who is not a member of the LGBTQ community, because I am a voice of privilege, right? I'm a white heterosexual male. You can't get any more privilege than that in this country. And you need partners like me to make it commonplace that this is important. And it's not important because it's a gay event. It's important because it's an event in our history. And these things like taking away books in schools are important because they're important, period. Not because of some slice or gender or race or sexual identity, right? And I think that as we collectively put things out, or others in the audience put things out, you get them into hands beyond your immediate circle. And that's a really important that's how we hit a critical mass, right, someday.
I know it's late. But,
yes, but you certainly.
Following on that, I really wanted to say that just 3 weeks ago, I got notice from a new member of the library board of St. Tammany Parish. It was a blast to his friends, I guess, and I hesitate doing things like that, but I decided to put on my most conservative lawyer suit, pinstripe with my lawyer tie, and I did go to the meeting to protest the 4 books that three ladies wanted to ban. So the first 3 speakers were all in favor, and there was silence after each speaker. I happened to just draw the card to be next, and I was the first to lay out my reasons why against it. And I was more nervous doing that than I was trying a federal jury trial so I said what I said. I heard a few boos and hisses behind me, and so I turned around to get myself out of there as quickly as I could. But when I did, I got a standing ovation. I went home. I didn't know what if it was in the council chambers. I didn't know the result. I just was so nervous and so upset that I went home, and I got a text that later that night the board voted unanimously to not ban them. Yeah. So you do have to get involved. You have to get involved.
Your voice matters. I want to thank our panels here. Thank you for what each of you is doing to further and continue the message. I want to thank all of you for your participation. You wonder on a Sunday morning, is anyone going to show up, much less is anyone going to speak up. I should have known with this group that wouldn't be a problem. Please support the works. Share the works, not only of the 4 of us up here, but those in the audience. There are obviously several books written. Sheri's work is in progress, so if you can find a few dollars to support her, I'll make a pitch on her behalf. Joey's work is out now, the first segment, and just the trailer alone is captivating.
Bobby's episode comes out this Wednesday, so if you want to hear Bobby and I have a conversation.
So I would challenge you as part of activism, not only listen to the show, share it with somebody, or share it in a Facebook group, or share it with not only your peers, but maybe people that it's a little bit uncomfortable to reach out to, because it's part of history. It's not part of gay history in a vacuum. Thank you so much, and thank you all.
Oh, thank you.
Yes, of course.